Comet, an O. Henry Memorial Award Prize story of 1921. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jyoti Taravanat. Comet, published originally under title The Comet by Samuel A. Derieux from American Magazine. No puppy ever came into the world under more favorable conditions than Comet. He was descended from a famous family of pointers. Both his mother and father were champions. Before he opened his eyes, while he was still crawling about over his brothers and sisters, blind as puppies are at birth, Jim Thompson, Mr. Devant's kennel master, picked him out. "That's the best one in the bunch." When he was only 3 weeks old, he pointed a butterfly that lit the yard in front of his nose. "Come here, Molly," yelled Jim to his wife. "Pointed, the little cuss." When Thompson started taking the growing pups out of the yard into the fields to the side of the Devant's great southern winter home, Oak Knob, it was Comet who strayed farthest from the man's protecting care. And when Jim taught them all to follow when he said heel, to drop when he said drop, and to stand stock still when he said ho, he learned far more quickly than the others. At 6 months, he set his first covey of quail and remained perfectly staunch. "He's going to make a great dog," said Thompson. Everything, size, muscle, nose, intelligence, earnestness, pointed to the same conclusion. Comet was one of the favored of the gods. One day, after the leaves had turned red and brown and the mornings grown chilly, a crowd of people, strangers to him, arrived at Oak Knob. Then out of the house with Thompson came a big man in tweed clothes, and the two walked straight to the curious young dogs, who were watching them with shining eyes and wagging tails. "Well, Thompson," said the big man, "which is the future champion you've been writing me about?" "Pick him out for yourself, sir," said Thompson confidently. After that, they talked a long time planning for the future of Comet. His yard training was now over. Thompson was the only yard trainer, and he must be sent to a man experienced in training and handling for field trials. "Larson is the man to bring him out," said the big man in tweeds, who was George Devant himself. "I saw his dogs work in the Canadian Derby." Thompson spoke hesitatingly, apologetically, as if he hated to bring the matter up. "Mr. Devant, you remember, sir, a long time ago, Larson sued us for old Ben." "Yes, Thompson, I remember, now that you speak of it." "Well, you remember the court decided against him, which was the only thing it could do, for Larson didn't have any more right to that dog than the Sultan of Turkey. But, Mr. Devant, I was there, and I saw Larson's face when the case went against him." Devant looked keenly at Thompson. "Another thing, Mr. Devant," Thompson went on, still hesitatingly. "Larson had a chance to get hold of his breed of pointers and lost out, because he dickered too long and acted cheesy. Now they turned out to be famous. Some men never forget a thing like that. Larson been talking these pointers down ever since, sir." "Go on," said Devant. "I know Larson's a good trainer, but it'll mean a long trip for the young dog to where he lives. Now, there's an old trainer who lives near here, Wade Swigert. There never was a straighter man than him. He used to train dogs in England. Devant smiled. Thompson, I admire your loyalty to your friends, but I don't think much of your business sense. We'll turn over some of the others to Swigert if he wants them. Comet must have the best. I'll ride Larson tonight. Thompson, tomorrow. Crate Comet and send him off. Just as no dog ever came into the world under more favorable auspices, so no dog ever had a bigger send-off than Comet. Even the ladies of the house came out to exclaim over him, and Marian Devant, pretty, 18 and a sportswoman, stooped down, caught his head between her hands, looked into his fine eyes, and wished him, "Good luck, old man." In the living room, the men laughingly drank toasts to his future, and from the high-columned portico, Marian Devant waved him goodbye, as in his clean padded crate he was driven off, a bewildered youngster, to the station. 2 days and 2 nights he traveled, and at noon of the third day, at a lonely railroad station in a prairie country that rolled like a heavy sea, he was lifted, crate and all, off the train. A lean, pale-eyed, sanctimonious-looking man came toward him. "Some beauty, that, Mr. Larson," said the agent as he helped Larson's man lift the crate onto a small truck. "Yes," drawled Larson in a meditative voice. "Pretty enough to look at, but he looks scared, timid." "Of course he's scared," said the agent. "So would you be if they was put you in some kind of a whale of a balloon and ship you in a crate to Mars." The station agent poked his hands through the slats and patted the head. Comet was grateful for that, because everything was strange. He had not whined nor complained on the trip, but his heart had pounded fast, and he had been homesick. And everything continued to be strange. The treeless country through which he was driven, the bald house and huge barns where he was lifted out, the dogs that crowded about him when he was turned into the kennel yard, these eyed him with enmity and walked around and round him. But he stood his ground staunchly for a youngster, returning fierce look for fierce look, growl for growl, until the man called him away and chained him to a kennel. For days Comet remained chained, a stranger in a strange land. Each time, at the click of the gate announcing Larson's entrance, he sprang to his feet from force of habit and stared hungrily at the man for the light he was accustomed to see in human eyes. But with just a glance at him, the man would turn one or more of the other dogs loose and ride off to train them. But he was not without friends of his own kind. Now and then another young dog, he alone was chained up, would stroll his way with wagging tail or lie down nearby in that strange bond of sympathy that is not confined to man. Then Comet would feel better and would want to play, for he was still half puppy. Sometimes he would pick up a stick and shake it, and his partner would catch the other end. They would tug and growl with mock ferocity, and then lie down and look at each other curiously. If any attention had been paid him by Larson, Comet would have quickly overcome his feeling of strangeness. He was no milksop. He was like an overgrown boy off at college or in some foreign city. He was sensitive and not sure of himself. Had Larson gained his confidence, it would have all been different. And as for Larson, he knew that perfectly well. One fine sunny afternoon, Larson entered the yard, came straight to him, and turned him loose. In the exuberance of his spirits, he ran round and round the yard, barking in the faces of his friends. Larson led him out, mounted a horse, and commanded him to heel. He obeyed with wagging tail. A mile or more down the road, Larson turned off into the fields. Across the saddle was something the young pointer had had no experience with: a gun. That part of his education Thompson had neglected, at least put off, for he had not expected that Comet would be sent away so soon. That was where Thompson had made a mistake. At the command, "Hie on!" the young pointer ran eagerly around the horse and looked up into the man's face to be sure he had heard all right. At something he saw there, the tail and ears drooped momentarily, and there came over him again a feeling of strangeness, almost of dismay. Larson's eyes were mere slits of blue glass, and his mouth was set in a thin line. At the second command, though, he galloped off swiftly, boldly. Round and round an extensive field of straw he circled, forgetting any feelings of strangeness now, every fiber of his being intent on the hunt, while Larson, sitting on his horse, watched him with appraising eyes. Suddenly there came to Comet's nose the smell of game birds, strong, pungent, compelling. He stiffened into an earnest, beautiful point. Heretofore, in the little training he had had, Thompson had come up behind him, flushed the birds, and made him drop. And now Larson, having quickly dismounted and tied his horse, came up behind him, just as Thompson had done, except that in Larson's hand was the gun. The old-fashioned black powder of a generation ago makes a loud explosion. It sounds like a cannon compared with the modern smokeless powder now used by all hunters. Perhaps it was only an accident that had caused Larson, before he left the house, to load his pump gun with black powder shells. As for Comet, he only knew that the birds rose. Then above his head burst an awful roar, almost splitting his tender eardrums, shocking every sensitive nerve, filling him with terror such as he had never felt before. Even then, in the confusion and horror of the surprise, he turned to the man, head ringing, eyes dilated. A single reassuring word, and he would have steadied. As for Larson, though he declared afterward, to others and to himself even, that he noticed no nervousness in the dog, that he was only intent on getting several birds for breakfast. Twice, 3 times, 4 times, the pump gun bellowed in its cannon-like roar, piercing the eardrums, shattering the nerves. Comet turned, one more glance backward at a face, strange, exultant, and then the puppy in him conquered. Tail tucked, he ran away from that shattering noise. Miles he ran, now and then stumbling over briars. He yelped. Not once did he look back. His tail was tucked, his eyes crazy with fear. Seeing a house, he made for that. It was the noon hour, and a group of farm hands was gathered in the yard. One of them, with a cry, "Mad dog!" ran into the house after a gun. When he came out, they told him the dog was under the porch, And so he was, pressed against the wall in the darkness, the magnificent young pointer with the quivering soul waited, panting, his eyes gleaming, the horror still ringing in his ears. Here Lorson found him that afternoon. A boy crawled underneath the porch and dragged him out. He who had started life favored of the gods, who that morning even had been full of high spirits, who had circled the field like a champion, was now a cringing, shrieking creature, like a homeless cur. And thus it happened that Comet came home in disgrace. A gun-shy dog, a coward, expelled from college, not for some youthful prank, but because he was yellow. And he knew he was disgraced. He saw it in the face of the big man, Devant, who looked at him in the yard where he spent his happy puppyhood, then turned away. He knew it because of what he saw in the face of Jim Thompson. In the house was a long and plausible letter explaining how it happened. I did everything I could. I never was as surprised in my life. The dog's hopeless. As for the other inhabitants of the big house, their minds were full of the events of the season. Deluxe hunting parties, more society events than hunts, lunches in the woods served by uniformed butlers, launch rides up the river, arriving and departing guests. Only one of them, except Devant himself, gave the gun-shy dog a thought. Marianne Devant came out to visit him in his disgrace. She stooped before him as she had done on that other and happier day, and again caught his head between her hands. But his eyes did not meet hers, for in his dim way he knew he was not now what he had been. "I don't believe he's yellow inside," she declared, looking up at Thompson, her cheeks flushed. Thompson shook his head. "I tried him with a gun, Miss Marian," he declared. "I just showed it to him and he ran into his kennel. I'll go get mine. He won't run from me." But at sight of a small gun it all came back. Again he seemed to hear the explosion that had shattered his nerves. The terror had entered his very soul. In spite of her pleading, he made for his kennel. Even the girl turned away from him now, and as he lay panting in the shelter of his kennel, he knew that never again would men look at him as they had looked, or life be sweet to him as it had been. Then there came to Oak Knob an old man to see Thompson. He had been on many seas. He had fought in a dozen wars, and had settled at last on a little truck farm nearby. Somewhere in his life full of adventure and odd jobs, he had trained dogs and horses. His face was lined and seamed, his hair was white, his eyes piercing, blue, and kind. Wade Swiggert was his name. "There's been dirty work," he said when he looked at the dog. "I'll take him if you're going to give him away." Give him away? Who had been championship help? Marianne Devant came out and looked into the face of the old man shrewdly, understandingly. "Can you cure him?" she demanded. "I doubt it, miss," was the sturdy answer. "You'll try?" The blue eyes lighted up. "Yes, I'll try." "Then you can have him. And if there's any expense—" "Come, Comet," said the old man. That night, in a neat, humble house, Comet ate supper placed before him by a stout old woman who had followed this old man to the ends of the world. That night he slept before their fire. Next day he followed the old man all about the place. Several days and nights passed this way. Then, while he lay before the fire, old Swigert came in with a gun. At the sight of it, Comet sprang to his feet. He tried to rush out of the room, but the doors were closed. Finally, he crawled under the bed. Every night after that, Swigert got out the gun, until he crawled under the bed no more. Finally, one day, the man fastened the dog to a tree in the yard, then came out with a gun. A sparrow lit in a tree, and he shot it. Comet tried to break the rope. All his panic had returned, but the report had not shattered him as that of the other did, for the gun was loaded light. After that, frequently, the old man shot a bird in his sight, loading the gun more and more heavily, and each time after the shot, coming to him, showing him the bird, and speaking to him kindly, gently. But for all that, the terror remained in his heart. One afternoon, the girl, accompanied by a young man, rode over on horseback, dismounted, and came in. She always stopped when she was riding by. "It's mighty slow business," old Swigert reported. "I don't know whether I'm making any headway or not." That night, old Mrs. Swigert told him she thought he had better give it up. It wasn't worth the time and worry. The dog was just yellow. Swigert pondered a long time. "When I was a kid," he said at last, "there came a terrible thunderstorm. It was in South America. I was water boy for a railroad gang, and the storm drove us in a shack. While lightning was hitting all around, one of the grown men told me it always picked out boys with red hair. My hair was red, and I was little and ignorant. For years I was scared of lightning. I never have quite got over it, but no man ever said I was yellow." Again he was silent for a while. Then he went on. "I don't seem to be making much headway. I admit that. I'm letting him run away as far as he can. Now I've got to shoot and make him come toward the gun himself, right while I'm shooting it." Next day, Comet was tied up and fasted until he was gaunt and famished. Then, on the afternoon of the third day, Mrs. Swigert, at her husband's direction, placed before him, within reach of his chain, some raw beefsteak. As he started for it, Swigert shot. He drew back, panting. Then, hunger getting the better of him, started again. Again Swigert shot. After that, for days, Comet ate to music, as Swigert expressed it. Now, he said, he's got to come toward the gun when he's not even tied up. Not far from Swigert's house is a small pond, and on one side the banks are perpendicular. Towards this pond the old man, with the gun under his arm and the dog following, went. Here, in the silence of the woods, with just the two of them together, was to be a final test. On the shelving bank, Swigert picked up a stick and tossed it into the middle of the pond with the command to fetch. Comet sprang eagerly in and retrieved it. Twice this was repeated. But the third time, as the dog approached the shore, Swigert picked up the gun and fired. Quickly, the dog dropped the stick, then turned and swam toward the other shore. Here, so precipitous were the banks, he could not get a foothold. He turned once more and struck out diagonally across the pond. Swigert met him and fired. Over and over it happened. Each time after he fired, the old man stooped down with extended hand and begged him to come on. His face grim now, and though the day was cool, sweat stood out on his brow. "You'll face the music," he said, "or you'll drown. Better be dead than cold yellow." The dog was growing weary now. His head was barely above water. His efforts to clamber up the opposite bank were feeble, frantic. Yet each time as he drew near the shore, Swigut fired. He was not using the light loads now. He was using the regular load of the bird hunter. Time had passed for temporizing. The sweat was standing out all over his face. The sternness in his eyes was terrible to see, for it was the sternness of a man who is suffering. A dog can swim a long time. The sun dropped over the trees. Still, the firing went on regularly, like a minute gun. Just before the sun set, an exhausted dog staggered toward an old man almost as exhausted as he. The dog had been too near death and was too faint to care now for the gun that was being fired over his head. On and on he came toward the man, disregarding the noise of the gun. It would not hurt him, that he knew at last. He might have many enemies, but the gun in the hands of this man was not one of them. Suddenly, old Swigut sank down and took the dripping dog in his arms. "Old boy," he said, "old boy." That night, Comet lay before the fire and looked straight into the eyes of a man as he used to look in the old days. Next season, Larsen, glancing over his sporting papers, was astonished to see that among promising derbies the fall trials had called forth was a pointer named Comet. He would have thought it some other dog than the one who had disappointed him so by turning out gun-shy, in spite of all his efforts to prevent, had it not been for the fact that the entry was booked as Comet, owner Miss Marion Devant, handler Wade Swigut. Next year he was still more astonished to see in the same paper that Comet, handled by Swigut, had won first place in a Western trial and was prominently spoken of as a national championship possibility. As for him, he had no young entries to offer, but was staking everything on the national championship, where he was to enter Larsen's Peerless II. It was strange how things fell out, but things have a habit of turning out strangely in field trials as well as elsewhere. When Larsen reached the town where the national championship was to be run, there on the street, straining at the leash held by old Swigut, whom he used to know, was a seasoned young pointer, with a white body, a brown head, and a brown saddle spot, the same pointer he had seen 2 years before turn tail and run in that terror a dog never quite overcomes. But the strangest thing of all happened that night at the drawing, when, according to the slips taken at random from a hat, it was declared that on the following Wednesday Comet the pointer was to run with Peerless II. It gave Larsen a strange thrill, this announcement. He left the meeting and went straight away to his room. There for a long time he sat pondering. Next day at a hardware store he bought some black powder and some shells. The race was to be run next day, and that night in his room he loaded 6 shells. It would have been a study in faces to watch him as he bent over his work, on his lips a smile. Into the shells he packed all the powder they could stand, all the powder his trusted gun could stand, without bursting. It was a load big enough to kill a bear, to bring down a buffalo. It was a load that would echo and re-echo in the hills. On the morning that Larsen walked out in front of the judges on the field, Peerless II at the leash, old Swigut with Comet at his side, he glanced around at the field or spectators. Among them was a handsome young woman, and with her, to his amazement, George Devant. He could not help chuckling inside himself as he thought of what would happen that day. For once a gun-shy dog Always a gun-shy dog. That was his experience. As for Comet, he faced the straw fields eagerly, confidently, already a veteran. Long ago, fear of the gun had left him for the most part. There were times when at a report above his head he still trembled, and the shocked nerves in his ear gave a twinge like that of a bad tooth. But always at the quiet voice of the old man, his God, he grew steady and remained staunch. Some disturbing memory did start within him today as he glanced at the man with the other dog. It seemed to him as if in another and an evil world he had seen that face. His heart began to pound fast, and his tail drooped for a moment. Within an hour it was all to come back to him. The terror, the panic, the agony of that far-away time. He looked up at old Swigert, who was his God, and to whom his soul belonged, though he was booked as the property of Miss Marianne Devant. Of the arrangements he could know nothing, being a dog. Old Swigert, having cured him, could not meet the expenses of taking him to field trials. The girl had come to the old man's assistance, an assistance which he had accepted only under condition that the dog should be entered as hers, with himself as handler. "Are you ready, gentlemen?" the judges asked. "Ready," said Larsen and old Swigert. And Comet and Peerless too were speeding away across the field, and behind them came handlers and judges and spectators, all mounted. It was a race people still talk about, and for a reason. For strange things happened that day. At first, there was nothing unusual. It was like any other field trial. Comet found birds, and Swigert, his handler, flushed them and shot. Comet remained steady. Then Peerless too found a covey, and Larsen flushed them and shot. And so for an hour it went. Then Comet disappeared, and old Swigert, riding hard and looking for him, went out of sight over a hill. But Comet had not gone far. As a matter of fact, he was nearby, hidden in some high straw, pointing a covey of birds. One of the spectators spied him and called the judge's attention to him. Everybody, including Larsen, rode up to him, but still Swigert had not come back. They called him, but the old man was a little deaf. Some of the men rode to the top of the hill but could not see him. In his zeal, he had got a considerable distance away. Meanwhile, here was his dog, pointed. If anyone had looked at Larsen's face, he would have seen the exultation there, for now his chance had come, the very chance he had been looking for. It's a courtesy one handler sometimes extends another who is absent from the spot to go in and flush his dog's birds. "I'll handle this covey for Mr. Swigert," said Larsen to the judges, his voice smooth and plausible, on his face a smile. And thus it happened that Comet faced his supreme ordeal without the steadying voice of his God. He only knew that ahead of him were birds, and that behind him a man was coming through the straw, and that behind the man a crowd of people on horseback were watching him. He had become used to that. But when out of the corner of his eyes he saw the face of the advancing man, his soul began to tremble. "Call your dogs in, Mr. Larsen," directed the judge. "Make him back stand." Only a moment was lost, while Peerless, a young dog himself, came running in and at a command from Larsen, stopped in his tracks behind Comet and pointed. Larsen's dogs always obeyed, quickly, mechanically. Without ever gaining their confidence, Larsen had a way of turning them into finished field trial dogs. They obeyed because they were afraid not to. According to the rules, the man handling the gun has to shoot as the birds rise. This is done in order to test the dog's steadiness when a gun is fired over him. No specification is made as to the size of the shotgun to be used. Usually, however, small gauge guns are carried. The one in Larson's hands was a 12 gauge and consequently large. All morning he had been using it over his own dog. Nobody had paid any attention to it because he shot smokeless powder. But now, as he advanced, he reached into his left-hand pocket of his hunting coat, where 6 shells rattled as he hurried along. 2 of these he took out and rammed into the barrels. As for Comet, still standing rigid, statuesque, he heard, as had been said, the brush of steps through the straw, glimpsed a face, and trembled. But only for a moment. Then he steadied, head high, tail straight out. The birds rose with a whir, and then was repeated that horror of his youth. Above his ears that would always be tender, broke a great roar. Either because of his excitement, or because of a sudden wave of revenge, or of a determination to make sure of the dog's flight, Larson had pulled both triggers at once. The combined report shattered through the dog's eardrums. It shivered through his nerves. He sank in agony into the straw. Then the old impulse to flee was upon him, and he sprang to his feet and looked about wildly. But from somewhere in that crowd behind him came to his tingling ears a voice, clear, ringing, deep, the voice of a woman he knew, pleading as his master used to plead, calling on him not to run, but to stand. "Steady," it said, "steady, Comet." It called him to himself. It soothed him. It calmed him. And he turned and looked toward the crowd. With the roar of the shotgun, the usual order observed in field trials was broken up. All rules seemed to have been suspended. Ordinarily, no one belonging to the field is allowed to speak to a dog. Yet the girl had spoken to him. Ordinarily, the spectators must remain in the rear of the judges. Yet one of the judges had himself wheeled his horse about and was galloping off, and Marion Devant had pushed through the crowd and was riding toward the bewildered dog. He stood staunch where he was, though in his ears was still a throbbing pain, and through all about him this growing confusion he could not understand. The man he feared was running across the field yonder, in the direction taken by the judge. He was blowing his whistle as he ran. Through the crowd, his face terrible to see, his own master was coming. Both the old man and the girl had dismounted now, and were running toward him. "I heard," old Swigert was saying to her. "I heard it. I might have known. I might have known." "He stood," she panted, "like a rock. Oh, the brave, beautiful thing." "Where's that?" Swigert suddenly checked himself and looked around. A man in the crowd they had all gathered about now laughed. "He's gone after his dog," he said. "Peerless has run away." End of Comet. Recording by Jyoti Taravanat.